January 17, 1944, Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. The snow fell in thick curtains across the Ozark Hills, muffling the world in white silence. Behind the double-fenced wire of prisoner of war camp number 3, 37 German soldiers stood in formation, breath rising in pale clouds, watching an American sergeant approach with a clipboard and an expression they had learned meant something unusual was about to happen. They had been in America for 6 weeks, captured in Tunisia, shipped across an ocean they had been told was filled with Allied convoys starving under U-boat siege. The voyage had been bewildering, the food abundant, the guards indifferent rather than cruel. And now, in this frozen corner of Middle America, they were being told they would attend something called a community social event, as part of a War Department initiative to demonstrate American civic life to enemy prisoners. None of them understood what that meant. They would by midnight. The war had taught them many languages, the language of artillery, of retreat, of surrender. But nothing in their training, nothing in the photographs shown in Signal magazine or the speeches delivered in market squares across the Reich, had prepared them for the language of abundance they were about to witness. In 3 hours, they would stand at the edge of a dance hall in Waynesville, Missouri, and watch American civilians, factory workers and farm hands, waitresses and clerks, dancing under strings of colored lights to music played by a live band. They would see women in dresses that used more fabric than a week's ration in Hamburg. They would smell roasted chicken and fresh bread, watch teenagers laughing over bottles of Coca-Cola, observe married couples dancing close while their children ate ice cream at small tables near the bandstand. And in that observation, something would crack in the carefully constructed worldview they had carried across the Atlantic, a fissure that would widen into comprehension, then doubt, then a terrible understanding of what they had been told versus what actually existed. But that comprehension lay hours ahead. For now, they simply stood in the snow, waiting to board the trucks, unaware that they were about to witness the most effective propaganda the United States never intended to create. The architecture of totalitarian belief systems requires constant maintenance. Every ideology built on the supremacy of one people over another must continually reinforce the inferiority of the perceived enemy, must constantly refresh the narrative of scarcity, decline, and degeneracy, afflicting those outside the blessed circle of the master race. The Germany these soldiers had left behind, most of them in early 1943, before the full weight of Allied strategic bombing had begun reshaping German cities into moonscapes, was a nation that had been told for over a decade that democracy was weakness, that America was a mongrel nation tearing itself apart, that Jewish financiers and racial mixing had produced a hollow society of jazz music and crime, incapable of martial virtue, surviving only on stolen wealth and the exploitation of colonial holdings. The propaganda had been sophisticated and relentless. Newsreels showed breadlines in Detroit, dust storms in Oklahoma, strikes in Pittsburgh. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, had distributed photographs of American poverty, sharecroppers in the Deep South, Hoovervilles during the Depression, unemployment lines stretching around city blocks. These images were real, but they were presented as the totality of American existence, the inevitable result of racial democracy and capitalist chaos. German soldiers had been taught that the American military was a disorganized rabble, that American tanks were flimsy, that American soldiers were too soft for real combat, that the entire edifice of the United States was a facade concealing moral and material bankruptcy. This narrative had survived first contact with American forces in North Africa, though barely. The prisoners now standing in the Missouri snow had encountered American artillery that seemed infinite, American logistics that delivered fresh supplies to the front, while German quartermasters rationed gasoline, American medics who treated German wounded with the same care as their own. These observations had been troubling but explainable, battlefield abundance did not necessarily reflect civilian reality. The Third Reich, after all, could mobilize total war. Perhaps America could do the same, stripping its home front to feed its armies. The prisoners had been captured, processed, shipped across an ocean in the holds of Liberty ships whose mass production they had been told was impossible. They had arrived at East Coast ports and seen cities lit up at night, seen stevedores unloading cargo with electric cranes, seen warehouses stacked with goods. They had been loaded onto trains that ran on schedule through a landscape unmarked by war. No bombed rail yards, no destroyed bridges, no burned villages. They had eaten better as prisoners than they had as soldiers in the last months before capture. But all of this could be rationalized. They were prisoners, and the Geneva Convention required adequate food. They were being transported through military corridors where security and supply were naturally concentrated. The true America, the exhausted, exploited, racially chaotic America of Goebbels' newsreels, must lie somewhere beyond the wire, suffering in silence, holding together only through the application of Jewish financial manipulation and the threat of Roosevelt's police state. The community social at Waynesville would offer no such comfort. The decision to expose Axis prisoners to American civilian life had emerged from an unlikely mixture of humanitarian impulse and strategic calculation. The War Department, working with the State Department and the International Red Cross, had determined that prisoner treatment could serve multiple purposes. Adherence to the Geneva Convention was both morally necessary and strategically valuable. It encouraged enemy soldiers to surrender rather than fight to the death, and it protected American prisoners held by Germany and Japan through the principle of reciprocity. But beyond mere compliance with international law, some officials recognized that prisoners who returned to their homelands after the war would carry memories that could shape post-war attitudes. If German soldiers could be shown that American democracy was not the hollow degeneracy described by Nazi propaganda, they might return home with a different story to tell. The program was modest and controversial. Many Americans opposed any kindness toward enemy prisoners. Families who had lost sons in Europe questioned why German POWs should eat well and live in relative comfort, while American boys died overseas. But the War Department persisted, and across the country, in camps from Texas to New York, German and Italian prisoners were put to work harvesting crops, building roads, processing timber. They lived among Americans, saw how communities functioned, observed a society at war that nonetheless maintained peacetime rhythms, churches and schools, newspapers and radio, shops and social gatherings. Waynesville, Missouri, was a small town swollen by the military presence at Fort Leonard Wood. The Army base had been built in 1940, transforming a rural county almost overnight. Construction workers had flooded in, followed by soldiers, then support staff, then the families of officers and contractors. The population had quadrupled. Housing was tight, but there was work for everyone. The town had 3 dance halls by 1944, 2 bowling alleys, 4 movie theaters, and a main street lined with shops that stayed open late to serve the evening crowds. On Saturday nights, the Waynesville Community Hall hosted dances that drew hundreds: soldiers on leave, civilian workers, local families, teenagers in their Sunday best. A rotating roster of local bands played swing and country, big band standards and sentimental ballads. The admission was 50 cents for military personnel, 75 cents for civilians, and the proceeds went to war bond drives and Red Cross fundraising. It was one of these dances, ordinary, unremarkable, repeated in thousands of American towns every weekend, that the prisoners would attend. They rode in 2 covered trucks, accompanied by 4 guards who had been briefed to remain unobtrusive. The prisoners wore standard POW uniforms, dyed blue to distinguish them from American military attire. But they had been issued winter coats, and in the evening darkness, they would not be immediately identifiable unless someone looked closely. The goal was observation, not confrontation. They would enter through a side door, remain in a designated section with clear sight lines to the dance floor and refreshment tables, and depart after 2 hours. The guards carried sidearms but had been instructed to remain relaxed. This was not a combat situation. This was an education. The trucks rolled through the winter darkness, past farmhouses lit by electric lamps, past roadside diners with neon signs, past gas stations where automobiles, so many automobiles, sat waiting for Monday morning. The prisoners watched through the canvas flaps, silent. Some of them had not seen civilian life in years. Some of them had never seen America. All of them carried expectations shaped by a decade of propaganda, and those expectations were already under strain. When the trucks stopped and the tailgates dropped, they could hear music, a big band arrangement of In the Mood, brass and drums, and the bright swing rhythm that Nazi ideologists had condemned as degenerate. They could smell roasting meat and coffee, tobacco smoke and perfume. And when they filed through the side entrance into the warmth and light of the Waynesville Community Hall, they stepped into a world that should not have existed. The hall was a simple structure, wooden floors, exposed beam ceiling, a stage at one end where a 9-piece band played under colored spotlights. The walls were decorated with patriotic bunting and war. Around the perimeter, tables were laden with food, platters of fried chicken and roast beef, bowls of mashed potatoes and green beans, baskets of fresh bread, pies and cakes arranged on tiered stands. A long table near the entrance served as a refreshment station where volunteers poured coffee and lemonade, dispensed bottles of soda, and handed out paper plates laden with food to anyone who approached. The prisoners were led to a section of folding chairs along the right wall, positioned so they could observe without obstructing the dancers. A few local residents glanced their way, registered the blue uniforms, and returned to their conversations without apparent concern. This was Fort Leonard Wood's territory. German prisoners were a common sight working in the fields or repairing roads. Their presence at a dance was unusual but not alarming. The war was something that happened elsewhere. Here there was music and food and a few hours of forgetting. For the prisoners, there was no forgetting. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 23 years old from a village outside Stuttgart, had been a member of the Hitler Youth since age 10. He had absorbed the ideology with the unquestioning fervor of adolescence. The racial theories, the mythologies of blood and soil, the narratives of German superiority and American degeneracy. He had believed, utterly and completely, that Germany was fighting for civilization itself against a coalition of Jewish manipulators, Slavic subhumans, and decadent Western democracies that had grown soft and corrupt. He had expected America to be a land of violence and privation, a society held together only by propaganda and the threat of state force, a place where the masses suffered while a Jewish elite lived in luxury. What he saw in Waynesville, Missouri, on the evening of January 17, 1944, fit none of those expectations. The women were well fed. That was the first observation, stark and undeniable. Not simply adequate but healthy, their skin clear, their movements energetic. The dresses they wore were not uniform or utilitarian but varied and individual, floral prints in solid colors, different cuts and styles, some modest, some fashionable. Fabric was rationed in America, he had been told. Clothing was scarce. But these women wore dresses that used yards of material, dresses that suggested abundance rather than scarcity, personal choice rather than state allocation. The men were similarly well fed. The soldiers on leave carried themselves with casual confidence, laughing easily, dancing without self-consciousness. The civilian men, factory workers, he guessed, or farm hands, showed no signs of oppression or exhaustion. They moved between the dance floor and the refreshment tables with the easy rhythm of people accustomed to leisure, to pleasure, to the expectation that Saturday night meant music and food and community gathering. And the food itself. Hartman had been a prisoner for 6 weeks. He had been fed adequately, protein and vegetables, sufficient calories to maintain health. He had assumed this was the Geneva Convention requirement, a military allocation that did not reflect civilian reality. But here, in a small-town community hall in the middle of America, there was enough food to feed an army. Not military rations, but civilian abundance. Roasted meats and fresh vegetables, pies made with real sugar and butter, coffee served without stint, bottles of Coca-Cola lined up in metal tubs filled with ice. Ice in January. They had ice for cold drinks at a civilian dance in a small town in Missouri. Hartman watched a teenage girl approach the refreshment table and select a bottle of Coca-Cola from the tub. She opened it with a metal opener attached to the table by a chain, took a long drink, and handed the bottle to her companion, a boy in civilian clothes, perhaps 16 years old, too young yet for service. They laughed about something and moved toward the dance floor. Neither of them appeared to consider the bottle of soda anything remarkable. It was simply available, one of many, the expected refreshment at a Saturday night dance. In Stuttgart, Hartman's mother had not tasted real coffee in 2 years. His younger sister had not seen fresh oranges since 1941. The Hitler Youth meetings he had attended throughout his adolescence had served thin soup and black bread, and they had been told this was virtue, the willing sacrifice of the strong for the greater good of the race. Meanwhile, in Waynesville, Missouri, American teenagers drank Coca-Cola like water and threw their leftovers in the trash. Across the room, Jeffrader Ernst Vogel, a baker's son from Dusseldorf, was performing similar calculations. He had worked in his father's bakery until his conscription in 1942. He understood bread, the chemistry of flour and yeast, the economics of scarcity and substitution. In Dusseldorf, by the time he left, they were mixing sawdust into the flour to extend supply. The loaves were gray and tasteless, but people bought them because there was nothing else. He had been told that rationing was universal, that England was starving, that America was suffering, that Germany's sacrifices were no different from those of any nation at war. But the bread on the tables at Waynesville Community Hall was white and soft, made from real wheat flour, real yeast, real butter. It was the kind of bread he had made in his father's bakery in the early days, before the rationing, before the substitutions. And there were dozens of loaves, sliced and stacked, available to anyone who wanted them. People took slices, made sandwiches, left half-eaten portions on their plates. The waste alone would have fed a family in Dusseldorf for 3 days. Vogel felt something shift in his understanding, not a sudden revelation but a slow undermining, like water eroding the foundation of a building. The propaganda had been clear. America was exhausted, stretched thin, its people suffering under the strain of global war. But these people were not suffering. They were dancing. They were eating fresh bread and roasted chicken. They were drinking cold soda and hot coffee. They were laughing, and they were not afraid. That realization arrived slowly, settling over the prisoners like the snow outside. These civilians, factory workers and farmers, waitresses and clerks, moved through the evening without the tension that had marked German civilian life even before the bombing began. There were no air raid wardens checking blackout curtains, no posters demanding sacrifice and vigilance, no sense that the enemy might arrive at any moment. The war was something distant, something their men were fighting elsewhere. Here there was music and abundance and the casual assumption that this was normal, that this was how life should be. The band transitioned into a slower number, "I'll Be Seeing You," a sentimental ballad about separation and longing. Couples moved closer, swaying in tight circles. A soldier in Army Air Forces uniform danced with a woman in a green dress, her head resting against his shoulder, his hand at the small of her back. They moved as if they had all the time in the world, as if the war were a minor inconvenience rather than an existential struggle. Near the refreshment table, a group of teenage girls chatted and laughed. occasionally glancing toward a cluster of young soldiers who were clearly working up the courage to ask them to dance. The scene was utterly ordinary, domestic, peaceful. It was obscene, not in the moral sense, but in the literal sense. Obscene because it violated the narrative the prisoners had carried across the Atlantic. They had been told that America was a nation in decline, exhausted by internal contradictions, held together only by force and deception. They had been told that American civilians were suffering, that rationing was severe, that the people resented Roosevelt's war. They had been told that racial conflict was tearing the country apart, that crime was rampant, that American society was a facade concealing chaos and despair. But here, in this small-town dance hall, was a functioning community, integrated into the war effort but not consumed by it, contributing sons and labor and resources but not surrendering joy or normalcy. The people danced, they ate, they laughed, they moved through. Feldwebel Paul Schneider, a career soldier from Munich, had fought in Poland and France, had earned the Iron Cross second class at Sedan, had believed with absolute certainty that Germany was the future of Europe. He had seen German armor smash through Allied lines, had watched Polish cities fall in days, had marched down the Champs-Élysées, convinced that the Reich would last 1,000 years. But he had also seen the shortages begin, first luxuries, then necessities, then the basic materials of military supply. He had watched German logistics falter in Russia, had felt the cold of inadequate winter clothing, had gone days without hot food while the Wehrmacht struggled to maintain supply lines across impossible distances. And now he sat in Missouri watching American civilians waste food. A woman at a nearby table scraped the remains of her dinner into a trash bin, half a chicken breast, uneaten green beans, a portion of mashed potatoes. She did it without hesitation, without apparent awareness that she was discarding protein and calories that a German family would have treasured. She simply cleared her plate, disposed of the leftovers, and returned to the dance floor. The gesture was casual, automatic, the behavior of someone accustomed to abundance, someone who had never had to calculate whether there would be enough, someone who assumed that if she wanted more later, more would be available. Schneider had led men who died hungry. He had rationed ammunition because supplies were uncertain. He had watched the Wehrmacht transition from confident advance to desperate defense as the material balance shifted against Germany. He had been told that this was temporary, that new weapons were coming, that the fatherland's industrial capacity would overwhelm the Allies. But sitting in a Missouri dance hall, watching American civilians live in casual abundance, he understood with sudden clarity that Germany had never had a chance. This was not a nation at the edge of collapse. This was a nation that could fight a global war while its civilians danced on Saturday nights and threw away food they did not finish. The symbolic object that would haunt the prisoners' memories, the detail that would appear again and again in their letters and post-war testimonies, was not the food itself, but the Coca-Cola bottles. Dozens of them, lined up in metal tubs, available for the asking. The brown glass, the red and white label, the casual way Americans opened them and drank and sometimes left them half-finished on tables. Coca-Cola had been one of the cultural artifacts Nazi propaganda had seized upon as evidence of American degeneracy. A sweet, frivolous drink marketed with sophisticated advertising, a symbol of capitalist excess and empty consumerism. But here it was, abundant and cheap, accessible to teenagers at a small-town dance, present in quantities that suggested infinite supply. Jeffrader Vogel, the baker's son, would later write to his family that he had counted 43 Coca-Cola bottles visible at various moments during the evening, and that he had watched people dispose of bottles that were still one-third full. He would describe this detail with the precision of someone performing an inventory, cataloging the evidence of something he was struggling to comprehend. The bottles became, in his memory, a measurement of the gap between what he had been told and what he had witnessed, each bottle a small unit of abundance, each discarded portion a tiny proof of waste so casual it bordered on incomprehensible. But the Coca-Cola was only a symbol. The larger truth was the system that produced it, the industrial capacity, the distribution networks, the economic surplus that allowed a nation at war to manufacture and distribute a luxury beverage to small towns in Missouri. The bottles were evidence of something the prisoners were not yet ready to articulate, that America was not fighting on the edge of exhaustion, but from a position of such overwhelming material advantage that it could afford leisure and luxury while simultaneously producing the ships and planes and tanks that were grinding Germany into dust. The evening progressed. The band played Moonlight Serenade, String of Pearls, Don't Sit Under the Apple Tree. Couples danced. Children ran between the tables. A volunteer war bond salesman worked the crowd, but gently, without coercion, and people bought bonds with the casual generosity of those who had money to spare. Near the stage, a bulletin board displayed photographs of local men in service, smiling faces in uniform, boys who had left town and were now fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Gold stars marked 2 photographs, young men who would not return. But even here, the grief was contained, private, not allowed to overwhelm the community gathering. The living were honored by continuing to live, by dancing and eating and affirming that the world the soldiers were fighting for was worth defending. The prisoners watched it all with growing comprehension. Some of them withdrew into silence, processing what they were seeing in isolation. Others whispered to their comrades, comparing observations, testing interpretations. A few, the youngest or most ideologically committed, tried to find explanations that preserved the propaganda narrative. Perhaps this was a staged display, an elaborate deception meant to impress prisoners. But that explanation collapsed under scrutiny. The dance was too ordinary, the people too unself-conscious, the details too authentic. No one was performing for an audience. These were simply Americans doing what Americans did on Saturday nights, gathering in their communities to eat and dance and socialize. The prisoners were observers, but their observation was incidental. The dance would have proceeded exactly the same way without them. Perhaps, then, this was an isolated pocket of privilege, a wealthy town or a special gathering not representative of broader American experience. But Waynesville was not wealthy. It was a small town in rural Missouri, swollen by the military presence but fundamentally ordinary. The people at the dance were workers, soldiers on leave earning army pay, factory workers from the ordnance plant, farmers and shopkeepers and clerks. If they were suffering under wartime rationing, the suffering was invisible. If they were exhausted by total war, the exhaustion did not prevent them from dancing until midnight. The simplest explanation was the most difficult to accept, that everything they had been told about America was a lie, not a partial truth or an exaggeration, but a fundamental inversion of reality. America was not weak but staggeringly strong. American democracy was not chaotic but functional. American abundance was not a facade but real and deep, rooted in industrial capacity and agricultural productivity that made Germany's much-vaunted war economy look primitive by comparison. The thousand-year Reich, the master race, the inevitable victory, all of it depended on premises that dissolved the moment one looked directly at the evidence. Obergefreiter Hartmann would later describe the experience as similar to discovering that a map he had been using was drawn upside down. All the landmarks were present, but their relationships were inverted. He had been navigating by false coordinates, and now, suddenly, he was lost in a landscape that made no sense according to his previous understanding. Germany was supposed to be the strong nation, disciplined and unified, capable of total mobilization. America was supposed to be the weak nation, fractured by democracy and racial conflict, incapable of sustained effort. But the evidence contradicted the narrative. America was feeding its prisoners better than Germany fed its soldiers. America was producing consumer goods while fighting a two-front war. America was so wealthy that its small-town civilians could afford to waste food. The ideological structure Hartman had inhabited since childhood began to crack. Not all at once. Belief systems built over years do not collapse in an evening, but enough that doubt entered, and once doubt was present, it began to grow. At 10 o'clock, the band took a break. A local pastor offered a brief invocation, thanking God for the community's blessings, praying for the safety of those in service, acknowledging the sacrifices being made. It was a simple prayer, delivered without theatricality, but it revealed another dimension of American life that Nazi ideology had obscured: the persistence of religious faith in a secular democracy. Germany had subordinated the churches to state control, had promoted a neo-pagan mythology of blood and soil, had treated Christianity as a useful but ultimately dispensable element of social control. But here, in the middle of a dance, Americans prayed, publicly, voluntarily, and when the prayer concluded, they returned to dancing, seamlessly integrating the sacred and the secular, the communal and the individual. During the break, some of the prisoners were allowed to approach the refreshment tables. They moved hesitantly, uncertain of the protocol, but the volunteers served them without hesitation or hostility. Coffee was poured. Plates of food were offered. A middle-aged woman asked, in halting German learned from immigrant parents, if they had enough to eat. The question was sincere. She wanted to know if they were being treated well. When they assured her they were, she smiled and added extra portions to their plates, insisting they try the apple pie, telling them it was her daughter's recipe. Jeffrey Vogel accepted a slice of pie and ate it slowly, analyzing its construction with a baker's expertise. Real apples, real sugar, real butter in the crust. The rationing in America was supposed to be severe, but this pie contained ingredients that would have been luxuries in Germany, used here in a dessert served at a community dance. He finished the slice and found himself near tears, though he could not have explained why. Perhaps it was the kindness of the woman who served him. Perhaps it was the realization of how much had been hidden from him. Perhaps it was simply the taste of butter, of sugar, of abundance casually offered to an enemy prisoner by a civilian who bore no apparent animosity. The band resumed. The final hour passed. The prisoners watched, silent now, their observations moving beyond cataloging details to grappling with implications. If this was normal, if this was how ordinary Americans lived, then what did that mean about Germany? What did it mean about the war? What did it mean about the promises they had been given, the sacrifices they had been asked to make, the ideology they had been taught to believe? At midnight, the dance concluded. The band played the Star-Spangled Banner. Everyone stood. The prisoners stood as well, uncertain, and watched as Americans placed hands over hearts and sang their national anthem, not with martial ferocity but with simple patriotism, a communal affirmation of identity and belonging. When the anthem ended, people began collecting coats, saying goodbyes, drifting toward the exits. Volunteers started clearing tables, packing leftover food into boxes to be distributed to families in need. Even the scraps, the remnants of abundance, would be salvaged and used. Nothing would be wasted except what had already been discarded during the evening, and even that waste exceeded what most German families had to begin with. The prisoners filed out through the side door and climbed into the trucks for the return journey to Fort Leonard Wood. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear, filled with stars. The trucks rolled through the darkness, past the lit windows of American homes, past the neon signs of diners still open, past the ordinary, unremarkable landscape of a nation that did not know it was demonstrating the collapse of an ideology simply by existing. The transformation that began that night in Waynesville was not immediate or universal. Some prisoners clung to the propaganda narratives, finding explanations that preserved their worldview. The dance had been a deception. The abundance was localized. America was using its stolen colonial wealth to create an illusion. But these explanations grew thinner with each passing week as the prisoners lived in America, worked alongside American farmers, observed American life from the inside. The evidence accumulated: the roads, the trucks, the machinery, the food, the casual assumption of plenty that characterized even the poorest American communities. The propaganda had not simply exaggerated. It had inverted reality. Obergefreiter Hartmann would spend the remainder of the war at Fort Leonard Wood, working in agricultural details, harvesting crops alongside Mexican laborers and local farmhands. He would be repatriated to Germany in 1946, returning to a Stuttgart in ruins, a nation shattered and occupied, its cities destroyed, its people starving. He would work as a clerk in the reconstruction effort, and in that capacity, he would encounter other former soldiers, other former prisoners. And in quiet conversations, over watery soup in unheated offices, they would talk about what they had seen in America. Not the combat, not the imprisonment, but the dance halls and the Coca-Cola bottles, the food waste and the casual abundance, the realization that they had been lied to about everything. Gefreiter Vogel would return to Dusseldorf and rebuild his father's bakery. He would marry, have children, and refuse to speak about the war except in the vaguest terms. But his daughter would later recount that he kept a Coca-Cola bottle on a shelf in the bakery office, an artifact from his time as a prisoner, acquired somehow, preserved through the chaos of repatriation. When she asked why he kept it, he told her it was a reminder. Of what? She asked. Of the difference between what you're told and what's true, he said, and he would not elaborate further. Feldwebel Schneider would become a teacher in post-war Bavaria, instructing students in history and civics. He would be scrupulous in his teaching, insisting on primary sources, on evidence, on the critical examination of narratives. He would tell his students that the most important lesson of the war was not about victory or defeat, but about the necessity of questioning authority, of verifying claims, of recognizing that governments lie, and that one's duty was to think rather than to believe. When students asked about his experiences, he would describe the dance in Waynesville, the food, the music, the casual waste, the realization that everything he had been taught was propaganda. The students would listen, skeptical that a single evening could change someone's understanding so completely. But Schneider would insist. Sometimes one true thing is enough to shatter 1,000 lies. You just have to be willing to see it. The dance halls of America during World War II were sites of morale building, community cohesion, and romantic possibility. But for the German prisoners who witnessed them, they became something else. Laboratories of ideological collapse. The U.S. government had not intended this. The policy of allowing prisoners to observe civilian life was rooted in Geneva Convention obligations and vague hopes about post-war attitudes. But the effect was far more powerful than any deliberate propaganda could have achieved. The prisoners were not told that America was strong and prosperous. They were shown a community dance in a small Missouri town, and from that observation, they drew their own conclusions. The conclusions were devastating to Nazi ideology. The propaganda had depended on creating a false binary, German strength and discipline versus American weakness and chaos. But the reality was more complex and more damning. American democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, had produced a society wealthy enough to fight a global war without sacrificing civilian quality of life, diverse enough to integrate multiple ethnicities and religions into a functional whole, and confident enough to allow its enemies to observe its civilians dancing on Saturday nights. The Third Reich, by contrast, had mobilized every resource, demanded total sacrifice, and produced shortages, rationing, and eventual collapse. The symbolic power of the Coca-Cola bottles, the apple pies, the wasted food, these were not trivial details. They were evidence of economic surplus, of industrial capacity, of a system that could produce abundance even under the strain of total war. And that abundance was not distributed by state allocation, but access through market mechanisms that allowed individual choice, personal preference, and the casual assumption that if you wanted something, it would be available. This was the world Nazi ideology insisted was impossible. A mongrel democracy could not function. Racial mixing could not produce strength. Capitalism could not generate shared prosperity. Jewish influence could not coexist with social order. But here, observable and undeniable, was a functioning democracy, a prosperous multi-ethnic society, a capitalist economy generating enough wealth that civilians could afford leisure and luxury while simultaneously producing the material that was destroying Germany's armies. The evidence contradicted the ideology so completely that the ideology simply collapsed under scrutiny. In the decades after the war, historians would analyze the treatment of Axis prisoners in America and conclude that the policy had been largely successful. The vast majority of German and Italian prisoners were repatriated without incident. Many returned home with positive views of American society. Some emigrated to the United States in later years. The program demonstrated that humane treatment of prisoners was both morally correct and strategically valuable. But the deeper impact was psychological and ideological. The prisoners who witnessed American civilian life during the war became carriers of a truth that contradicted totalitarian propaganda. They returned to shattered nations and told their families, their friends, their children what they had seen. They described the abundance, the waste, the casual confidence of a society that did not fear its government or its neighbors. They became, without intending to, witnesses against the lies they had been taught. The dance in Waynesville was one evening among thousands of similar evenings in communities across America during the war years. It was unremarkable, ordinary, repetitive. But for the German prisoners who observed it, it was a revelation. A moment when the propaganda collapsed and reality intruded, undeniable and overwhelming. They had expected to find a nation in decline, exhausted by war and internal contradictions. Instead, they found people dancing. And in that discovery, in the gap between expectation and observation, the ideology of the master race dissolved into absurdity. Because if America, this chaotic democracy of mongrel races and jazz music, could produce such abundance and confidence while fighting a two-front war, then what did that say about Germany? What did it say about the promises of the Third Reich, the sacrifices demanded in the name of racial purity, the insistence that strength required totalitarian discipline? It said they had been lied to, completely, systemically, from the beginning. The snow had returned by the time the trucks delivered the prisoners back to Fort Leonard Wood. They filed out, formed ranks, were counted and dismissed to their barracks. They would rise the next morning to work details, to the routine of imprisonment, to the slow passage of days waiting for the war to end. But something had changed. The carefully constructed worldview they had carried across the Atlantic had been damaged, perhaps irreparably. In the years that followed, in the chaos of Germany's collapse and occupation, in the slow reconstruction of a shattered nation, these men would remember a Saturday night in Missouri. They would remember the music, the food, the Coca-Cola bottles, the casual waste. They would remember the kindness of the woman who served them apple pie, the teenagers dancing without fear, the community gathered in celebration despite the war. And they would understand, with the clarity that comes from witnessing rather than being told, that they had been on the wrong side not simply of a military conflict, but of a fundamental truth about how human beings could organize their societies. Democracy, for all its messiness and inefficiency, produced abundance. Totalitarianism, for all its claims of strength and discipline, produced scarcity. The difference was not propaganda, it was reality. And once you had seen reality, once you had stood in a Missouri dance hall and watched Americans live in casual prosperity, while their prisoners ate better than German soldiers, you could not unsee it. The ideology required that America be weak, but America was strong. The ideology required that democracy be chaotic, but democracy was functional. The ideology required that racial diversity be destructive. But diversity coexisted with social cohesion. Every premise was wrong. Every prediction was false. Every promise was a lie. And the proof was a dance hall in Waynesville, Missouri, where ordinary Americans gathered on a Saturday night in January 1944 to eat and dance and affirm, without knowing they were being observed, that freedom and abundance were not contradictions but complements, that strength did not require cruelty, and that a society built on individual dignity rather than racial mythology could not only survive but thrive. The prisoners who witnessed this would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, a moment when propaganda collapsed under the weight of observable truth, when ideology surrendered to evidence, when the architecture of totalitarian belief revealed itself as a structure built on sand, incapable of withstanding contact with the world as it actually existed. They had come to America expecting to find weakness. They found strength. They had expected chaos. They found order. They had expected suffering. They found abundance. And in that discovery, the Reich's promises dissolved like snow in spring, revealing the barren ground beneath. A decade of lies, a war fought for nothing, a generation sacrificed to an ideology that could not survive the